Welcome to the Our State Book Club podcast. I'm your host, New York Times bestselling author and North Carolina native Wiley Cash. In today's episode, we travel to the North Carolina mountains for a visit with Terry Roberts, author of The Sky Club. We'll learn about his life growing up in Madison County and what's kept him in these mountains after all these years. So Terry, we are here in your beautiful home, just a few miles north of Asheville, North Carolina. But you grew up a little bit farther north in Madison County, North Carolina. Can you tell us about growing up in Madison?
Yeah, my father's family farmed in Madison County since not the time of the Revolutionary War, but just after. There's a Roberts who was buried there in 1800. And in successive generations of subsistence farming, the Robertses primarily in a place called Big Pine, which shows up in the novel.
Yes, it does.
Joe Salter's home place.
Yes.
And I actually was the first generation to be born outside Madison. I was born in Asheville, spent hours and days, weeks, months in Madison growing up. Actually grew up about a mile from where we're sitting, but my orientation wasn't towards Asheville. It was towards the mountains.
Sure.
It was toward home,
Yeah.
which is downriver on the French Broad in Madison County. The other thing that really affected eventually writing novels, I think, is that at the home place where I grew up, my father's mother, Belva Anderson Roberts, I'm sitting in her rocking chair, to whom the Sky Club is dedicated, moved close to us, and by close, I mean 50 yards from us, before I remember. She was always a part of my life, and in many, many ways, she was my best friend as a new boy. So you have to imagine this woman who was born in 1888.
Wow.
In a place so isolated that it's hard to get to today. And she was a storyteller, as was my father. And in the most natural way, the way not let's sit down and let me tell you a story, Sonny, but you tell them as you're walking to the garden, or you tell them as you're going
Doing laundry
to feed the
on the
chickens.
porch.
Absolutely. Stories are just as a natural a part of life as for some people as singing is, for example.
Yeah.
And that's how I grew up.
I love that name, Belva. My dad's mother's name was Adeline, and my mom's mother's name was Pearlie. Both of them with the middle name Lucille, and they both went by Lucille, so I had two grandmothers named Lucille. So, you grew up here in the mountains. I like what you said about your orientation being more rural, because there is a sharp contrast between the city of Asheville, and there still is.
Oh, sure.
These rural spaces around it. But when it came time, you graduated high school, you went down the mountain and you kept going down I-40 to Chapel Hill.
That's right, yeah.
And when I think about you leaving the mountains and going to Chapel Hill, I can't help think about people like Thomas Wolfe and Charles Frazier. And obviously, we were both huge fans of those writers. What was it like leaving the mountains and going to Chapel Hill in the footsteps of Thomas Wolfe, who I know whose work you knew?
That's right. And we share that. We share, a love for Wolfe. We share a love for Chuck Frazier and his books. It was interesting. I can remember being a teenager in high school. And one day walking from our home on the old Weaverville Highway down close to the two-lane highway and looking at that highway and thinking, I live in the most beautiful place on earth.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell, this is it. You can't leave here and go someplace finer. But it's not beautiful if you don't choose it. There's a way in which a lot of the men and women I went to high school with never left Weaverville.
But never chose it.
They never chose it.
Yeah.
It was chosen for them.
Sure.
And so going away, and I was in Chapel Hill for over 25 years, going away gives you a whole new perspective.
Yeah.
And it gives you the opportunity to think about, do you want to keep going, end up in New York, end up traveling in Europe. All those things we love to do, but where truly is home.
Yeah.
And for me, my first novel, A Short Time to Stay Here, was written in Chapel Hill, and largely, I think, because I was homesick.
Sure.
I was homesick for the mountains
Yeah.
and homesick for family, not immediate family, but extended family.
Yeah.
Some of whom, of course, are no longer with us. Some of whom are buried within 50 miles of here.
Yes.
So that idea of going home, emphasis on the word home. Sorry, Thomas Wolfe, you can go home again. Was powerful, and it was a powerful draw. Robert Morgan, a writer we both admire and love, left for Cornell, but never left writing about
Sure.
Western North Carolina.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, when I think about Thomas Wolfe going down from Asheville, he felt confronted by a certain amount of prejudice about mountain people. And we have to remember he was there at the university at a very different time than you were. I mean, it was 60 years or so before you were. Um, did you feel that? He was facing kind of the remnants of planter culture, the reimagining of the lost cause and, gallant Southern knighthood and all that stuff. And they kind of saw him as this mountain bumpkin, which he really wasn't. He was a city kid.
Oh, sure.
The city.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But did you feel a certain, maybe not prejudice, but did you feel a certain caricaturization coming your way when you were down there?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think even today, there in North Carolina alone, there's this sense of the whole center of the state. In fact, what somebody once called the Golden Crescent, which starts in Charlotte and runs through Winston-Salem, Greensboro, into the Triangle. That Golden Crescent is where culture and civilization
Yeah.
exist in our state.
Yeah.
You go too far east, that's problematic. And you go too far west, well, that's even worse,
Yeah.
And so I felt that in Chapel Hill, and felt in a way a certain responsibility in it to not to fight it, that's too strong a term, but to somehow live within that prejudice and remember, because we both studied American literature, I both studied Southern literature, that there are many Souths.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
one of them is Appalachia.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
one of them is where I'm from. And I feel that to this day. There's a great John Ely story. He wrote a number of novels set in the mountains. And in fact, in some ways, is kind of the father of Appalachian literature. And his publisher could not get British publishers to bite on his books. And he received one famous letter which said, "We really admire Mr. Ely's work. Tell him to get out of the mountains."
Oh, wow.
And there's still some of that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've heard Ron Rash, who I know you know well, say, if you're a Southern writer or an Appalachian writer, it's like having a butt in front of your name. But you're this writer. You're this kind of writer. Whereas if you're in New York, you're just a writer.
Yeah.
You're not a New York City writer.
Absolutely.
You're just a writer. Yeah, John Ely, God, what a talent that guy was. And we were talking about Bill Friday before we started taping. But John Ely just gave so much to North Carolina, culturally, politically, artistically. What a giant. His role in the School of the Arts, his role in the literature. The Landbreakers is still to this day one of the best novels I've ever read.
Yeah.
It's been reissued. What's the New York Press? I can't think of the name.
Right.
New York Review of Books has reissued it.
Exactly.
Just a beautiful, beautiful novel. Speaking of that generation of writers, you've always been somebody that I've thought of as being particularly connected to the generation who came before you. And I know you became friends with a lot of those writers living in Chapel Hill.
Sure.
And who were some of the writers that you had relationships with, or maybe North Carolina writers that you studied that left their imprint on your life or your craft?
So it's a wonderful question, because I really do think of myself as existing in a tradition, in the same way that men and women who play mountain music
Mm.
imagine themselves in a tradition,
Mm-hmm.
almost something they learn knee to knee in
Sure.
a way. In Chapel Hill, I was very close friends with Doris Betts, who was not a mountain
Sure.
woman. She's more from your part of the world.
Mm.
Um, with Elizabeth Spencer, who was from Mississippi, who's my youngest son's godmother, both of whom were open, generous, funny,
Yeah.
uh, off color from time to time people. And then beyond that, very much, I've also felt very much connected to what you might loosely call mountain riders. And there's a long list of people that I knew who were very kind to me and were very generous with their time and their energy and their attention. Uh, and I'll list some, knowing full well I won't remember them all, but Robert Morgan and Fred Chappell and Ron Rash were all Lee Smith, who is one of the few people I know who is exactly who she seems to be.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's the Dolly Parton of American literature.
Absolutely. And with every wonderful thing that implies, right?
Yes.
It's interesting about John Ely. I wrote a fan letter to him in what must have been the very early 1980s, and this was sort of at the height of his fame.
Mm-hmm.
And when I wrote to him, this was, again, this will date it for you. I didn't email him, didn't exist.
Yeah.
This was a handwritten letter, copied carefully over, folded neatly in an envelope. Off it went, imagining to the great man. Imagine I was a young high school English teacher, imagining I'd never hear back from
Sure.
him. Well, 3 days later, here was this wonderful, funny reply, which led in turn eventually to meeting John and Rosemary. And I almost blush to say it, but we became lifelong friends. We were very close. Our families were close. And I introduced my mother to John Ely, and he was gallant, you know. But you're exactly right. He did for me what I know other writers have done for you and for me as well. But he was the one who taught me that rural Appalachia was a viable setting for literary fiction.
Sure. Yeah.
This little postage stamp of
Mm.
mountain soil, to borrow Faulkner's
Sure.
phrase, was viable,
Sure.
could speak to the world.
Yeah. When I went to graduate school and studied under Ernest Gaines, here's this guy who grew up on a plantation who's making it matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking, well, I can do this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I can write about the places I know, the places that I'm from. I think it's hard for our listeners or viewers who don't know. It's hard to state what giants of American literature, especially at the time,
Yeah.
Doris Betts and Elizabeth Spencer and John Ely and Lewis Rubin and a lot of these Chapel Hill, Winston-Salem, Asheville kind of I-40 corridor writers. I mean, these were the writers,
Yeah.
you know, that were just mammoth titans of American literature.
Absolutely.
I remember once, years ago, there was a North Carolina literary festival in Raleigh. I did an event with Lee, I think, for my first book. And Richard Ford came. And I think his book Canada had just come out. And I think he wasn't wild about coming to this new festival. I think it only lasted a couple of years. But he said, I will come if you can make sure I see Elizabeth Spencer.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so they arranged, I think he and Elizabeth went out and had dinner or something, and that's how they got Richard Ford to come.
There you go.
And, you know, of course we think of Richard Ford as a titan of American literature, and, you know, he was only going to do it if he could see Elizabeth.
Absolutely.
So I want to ask you, when you were down in Chapel Hill, and I'm kind of stuck in Chapel Hill, were there any professors that you studied under in your American lit training? And were there any other writers outside of Appalachia or outside of North Carolina that you thought, I'm going to do that?
I want to do that. No, it's a great question. And we were talking before we started filming about you learn to write by reading.
Sure. Yeah.
And so the thing that graduate school did for me, and I know did for you because we talked about it, is it taught us to read, right? And so, and not just read in a leisurely way to be entertained, but read as a student
Yeah.
of the language,
Sure.
and of the craft. Lewis, I was fortunate enough, just luck of the draw, I took Lewis Rubin's last um, seminar in Southern literature, his last graduate seminar in Southern literature. And after the first meeting, we met in his house once a week, which was not far from campus. You could walk there. It's kind of the traditional um, reason why we go to graduate
Sure.
school.
Yeah.
And I argued with him one day about Thomas Wolfe, which was stupid because, of course, I was wrong and he was right. I don't even remember what it was about, but let's just agree that he was right and I was wrong. But he laughed about it afterwards, and he said, "I knew I liked you when you talked back."
Yeah.
And he introduced me to these wonderful Southern writers, including Gaines, right? But Eudora Welty, in a way that I'd never read Eudora Welty. Um, the list goes on and on. Faulkner, in a way that I thought I had read
Yeah.
Faulkner until I read Faulkner with Reuben.
Yeah.
And so the pantheon of Southern writers came to life in that living room of that old house in Chapel Hill, hearing Lewis Rubin talk about them.
Yeah.
Um, I had the same experience with Elizabeth Spencer. I read one of her novels, The Salt Line, and you would see Elizabeth in the hallways of Greenlaw Hall, this kind of tall, elegant, regal
Very powerful.
woman dressed to the nines, when all the graduate students were wearing jeans with holes in them, heels that were down, et cetera. And I remember reading that book and thinking, there's a tiger in this building and nobody seems to know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, this is going to date me, but I wrote to her and left a note in her box in Greenlaw Hall. And I got back from her a postcard that said, "Thank you very much. I so appreciate what you say about the Salt Line. Um, here's my phone number. Call me up and let's get together." And there began a friendship that lasted almost to the day she died. Well, until the day she died, really. But and through her and through people like her, you meet all these other writers, not necessarily face to face,
Sure.
in person, but you meet them intellectually, you meet them creatively, and you begin to read and think in a way that you never did before.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think this is going to sound more grandiose than I really mean for it to, but I read Melville with Robert Bain, who was in the English department at Chapel Hill, and it changed my life. Reading really reading Moby
Sure.
Dick. There's this thing we do to illustrate our minds being blown.
Yeah.
That was that experience.
Yeah.
Where, this is what fiction can do.
I remember when I was in graduate school studying with Gaines, I took his last creative writing workshop that he taught before he retired, but he kind of hung around the university for a few years after that. And being at a conference with him and somebody saying, what advice do you have for young writers? And it wasn't go take creative writing. It wasn't join a writing group, or it was read and go be around writers who have done it before.
Yeah.
And when you go to be around writers who have done it before, and you're there in a genuine spirit of fellowship and curiosity,
Yeah.
it shows. Because you and I have both, we've never spoken to this, had experiences where you can tell people who are not there for those reasons.
Oh.
They're there for the shine or for the blurb or for the whatever they think they're going to get from it. But I feel like here in North Carolina, going back, as you were saying, decades, maybe forever, there is such a collegial spirit of kindness and just decency and friendship. Like, these are people who like each other. and it's made such an impression on me. And when I was a young writer, I'm no longer a young writer,
Well,
but it makes me want to look and see who's coming behind me
absolutely.
and saying, what did they need
Yeah.
that Ron Rash gave me
Right.
or that Lee Smith gave me?
Right.
We'll be right back. We'll take a little break and we'll be right back.
Sounds good.
This episode of the Our State Book Club podcast is sponsored by Deerfield Episcopal Retirement Community in Asheville, North Carolina.
We are back with Terry Roberts here in your beautiful home just a few miles north of Asheville. We are here to discuss not only your career, but also your novel, The Sky Club, which is your 5th novel. It's the April selection of the Our State Book Club. And I loved reading this book, and I told you it's also a beautiful book jacket. It's a gorgeous cover. So this tells the story of a young woman named Jo who leaves Madison County, and she goes down into Asheville in 1929, gets a job at a bank, and it's a coming-of-age story for Jo. She is country come to town.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm wondering how much of your own experience and that contrast between rural Madison County and urban Asheville and your understanding of your own family navigating those spaces going back into the early 20th century and late 19th century went into that novel.
Absolutely.
Was it research or was it remembering?
So much of it was remembering my own experience, but also that of my family. My grandmother, to whom Belva, to whom the book is dedicated, grew up in a place called Anderson Cove. And when she met my grandfather, who was named Julius Caesar Robert,
Oh my gosh.
they ended up eventually going back to Anderson Cove to raise their family, which included my dad. So my dad was born and grew up in a place that was so isolated. There was a 1-room, 8th grade schoolhouse. Probably, certainly not big, or probably not as big as the room we're sitting in.
Yeah.
And it was the church in this little community of Anderson Cove. It was also the school. And he and his brother ended up being sent to foreign school that became Warren Wilson. And so they traversed that road, as did my aunts, dad's sisters, of coming out of not just a place that was isolated, 19th century isolated, but could easily have been in the 18th century.
Sure.
Jo Salter, the character in the novel, when she comes to Asheville, she's never ridden in a car by the end of the novel.
She's never done a lot of stuff.
She's never done a lot of things.
Yeah.
She's never heard jazz. She
Never had her hair cut professionally.
never had her hair cut.
Yeah.
She gets her hair bobbed.
Never been to a clothing store. Yeah.
Exactly. On and on and on, all these things. She had picked up the receiver of a telephone and listened to the voice of the operator, but she had never spoken on it. And so there's a sense in which she's literally coming from one century almost into another century. And I don't know that that applied particularly to any one member of my family, but it certainly applied to the movement of the entire family as they came from a place and a time that we would have thought of as the 1800s, and now all of a sudden they're living in the 20th century. And so part of the movement of the book is that from one time to another, one place to another, but also the life that Jo had up until the time she leaves home at 26.
And her mother passes is kind of the impetus for her to leave.
Mother says, go make a life I can't even imagine.
Exactly. Go get what I didn't have.
Yeah. And, but the life she has had to that point in some ways prepares her for what she encounters, which is the Great Depression. The working title of this book was The Crash. And I thought that was the story. I thought it would end with the bank failures in 1930, and it would essentially, in the kind of classic sense, be a tragedy. but that it would end with essentially the failure of civilization, failure of society.
It's just what it felt like,
Yeah.
you know.
As it happened, um, when I arrived there, and I'm sure you've been through the same thing, I couldn't find the ending. And in fact, Joe wasn't done. By that point, she'd found the Sky Club, and there was a lot more to say.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, and I want to talk about the Sky Club as well. There's a scene in the novel that was there's a couple of moments in the novel where there's this scene where the farmer comes into the bank, and it's a farmer from back home, and Joe perks up, and it's a like a lifeline or a tether to the past,
mm,
and she kind of has this soul moment, and you know the girl that she is the understudy for, Jezzy, who's clueless cashier window girl, it just kind of seems like false and artificial and corny
mm,
and in comparison to this man who is very organic and very himself,
mm,
right? And then there's these little flashes of moments like that where there's a tether to back home that is a heartstring. But there's one scene, a very deeply emotional scene, that I don't want to get emotional talking about, where she can't sleep and she gets up and makes a toddy and thinks about her father sitting back home by the fireplace having a toddy because he can't sleep. Um, Tell me about that moment. Where did that moment come from for you?
well, i- if we filmed this later in the day, by the way, we'd have a toddy rather than a coffee, and it would be immeasurably better, I'm sure. But it's a scene where she's left home and she knows that she has to first imagine and then create her own life.
Mhm.
There's nothing that has been given to her as an identity, although she is irrevocably herself. She's strong, she's thoughtful, she's smart, she's very much a woman, even though there's still some coming of age things, of course, to happen. And she knows that because she left home after her mother's death, that her father is sitting 50 miles away in Big Pine in the rock house, sitting by that fireplace, rocking, drinking, probably white liquor, homemade. And she now has this, she's come to town, so she's found bourbon, which is a great discovery, of course. And she herself sheds more than a tear because she imagines them as two lonely stumps in a field.
Yeah,
Two,
that's exactly what she thinks.
you
Yeah.
know, and it's, it's winter.
Yeah.
It's the winter of their lives as well as the winter of the season. And she's connected to him in a way that will never die, um, or cease to be. And yet, and in being connected to him, she again is reminded of who she is. This is who I am, even though he's there and I'm here.
Yeah.
And that will never change. Um, but I have to somehow take that and make a life out
Yeah.
of it.
And then that is followed by it's nighttime and she's staying with her uncle
Hmm.
with his family, and he has a dinner that I think it's dinner that night or maybe recently told them we're moving out of this place and we're going to get our own, and they already live in what she perceives as being a really grand house in town.
Absolutely.
And they're going to move north, I guess up around Beaver Lake, and they're going to get
Big park.
a bigger pad.
Hmm.
And she is wandering around this house late at night while everybody is sleeping and thinking about how huge and empty it feels. And it does a great job. And so I love it when you can feel, and this might be what writers can feel. You feel the novel tilt, and the novel tilts right there. And it becomes about excess. It becomes about overpromising
Yep.
what the bank can do, what the city can hold, and then we meet the Sky Club.
Yeah.
And I'll let you talk about the Sky Club. Uh, but what I want to ask you, apart from to tell us about the Sky Club, which was a real place, how fun was it? Because it was fun to read. It was fun to read about her being on Charlotte Street. You even mentioned an address.
Yeah.
And walking down Charlotte Street, going to the bank, we have these different locales. We have places. Some of the addresses are still there. Some of the buildings are still there. You know, Asheville is a town that's very fortunate that it had the misfortune of not being able to afford to tear down its old buildings in many instances because they're still there.
Absolutely.
And so when you read the Sky Club, readers, viewers, listeners, you can come walk the landscape of this novel because a lot of it's still here. Um, what was it fun going back and looking at old pictures of places that you now from I forget when this come out in 2023 perspective, and seeing these old places like the Sky Club?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And that there's, for me, I'm one of those peculiar people for whom history is literally right there, you know. I walk down the street in Asheville or Marshall or Hot Springs, and in my imagination, it's almost like you're seeing a kind of strange camera obscura view of the world where this is what it is now.
Yeah.
And the Imperial Life Insurance Company in downtown Asheville, where Joe goes to work after the bank crashes. But at the same time, there's a bar and there's a restaurant and there's and these two things are laid over each other.
Forgive me for interrupting, but what you're describing reminds me of the Thomas Wolfe novella, The Lost Boy, where he is turning the corner of time, walking through downtown Asheville, the narrator is, and here's what it was. Daddy's stone carving shop was here. Now there's a building. It's just this, that's one of my favorite pieces that Wolfe wrote.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is because of exactly what you're describing. That convergence of time and memory and recognition of the contemporary moment. It's a real,
And
somebody,
somebody once said to me in one of these events that writers do, right? They came up to me afterwards and they said, when you walk down the street, do you like feel all that around you? And I said, yes, I'm about to scare you to death, but yeah,
yeah,
I see Joe Salter standing over there. I see Pink Starnes standing under there. I see one of the Westalls leaning up against the corner of the building, pairing his nails with a bucket knife. Oh, you go by the old Kentucky home and you see Julie Wolfe sitting out on the porch, rocking, with that tight, pursed look on her face. So that's a curse and a blessing, right? It makes it hard to live totally in the present sometimes. But it also, in a literary world, a created world, it gives it depth.
yeah.
Which is exactly what you're talking about when you talk about Wolf. I hope when you talk about Sky Club. Yeah, you can. In fact, we've done it several times, and I'll go ahead and say to the readers of our state, it can begin and end at a bar if you wanted to, but you can do a Sky Club tour, a walking tour of Asheville, and see setting after setting.
Sure. Well, tell us about the Sky Club.
So the Sky Club it's a real place. The cover that you like so much is a photograph that my son took with a drone, so that you could of the building and
Which is still there.
And it's still there. It's condos now, of course, like everything in Asheville. And it was a quote supper club for years, starting right before World War II. It was a private residence in 1930, so I had to move the club part up in time so that Joe could go there and meet Levi Earwood. For years, it existed just on the border of whatever the current liquor laws were, right? And I'm sure they bent those laws and broke those laws more than once. Robert Mitchum partied at the Sky Club when he was here to make Thunder Road. It was that kind of place, and I still meet older people who went there with their parents or whose parents partied at the Sky Club. What I imagined initially when I thought the book was much more tragic, darker in tone, and there's a lot of darkness in this book, I think, I feel like, is that it would end there. But once Joe found the Sky Club, there began to be, in my imagination, flowing up out of my subconscious, this desire to balance the life of the bank with the life some other truth, as Joe says. There's the numerical truth of the bank,
Mm-hmm.
daylight truth, and then there's a dark truth. And in this case, the dark truth is not dark as in tragic, but dark as in jazz,
Yeah.
dark as in booze, and dark as in dancing the Black Bottom or the Charleston. And so I feel like it began to be a kind of balancing act between the two.
Yeah.
And then once the bank fails, again, spoiler alert, the Sky Club becomes predominant. And Joe, the love interest in the book, Levi Airwood, the mysterious Airwood, becomes a very integral part of Joe's life. And so she now, who's this incredibly strong, independent flapper of a woman, has to decide eventually what she thinks about money, what she thinks about music, what she thinks about a life. And what do you do with a man in that life?
Yeah.
And so all these things come to the fore.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful to write. And then
So when I was reading The Sky Club, there was a moment where I don't know if it was Joe's uncle, it was somebody involved with the bank, is just spouting. I think it's when she goes to the real estate office.
Absolutely.
And they're spouting all of these facts and figures and kind of catchphrases about Asheville. And, you know, I remember even when I first moved to Asheville in the early 90s, there were catchphrases like, even in the summer, you have to wear a sweater at night.
Oh, yeah.
In Asheville, it's all about altitude affects attitude, you know? And so, but these catchphrases are not new.
Oh, yeah.
They're marketing campaign slogans. And, you know, I know you're a big Thomas Wolfe fan, as am I. And I think the first time we met was over Thomas Wolfe at
Absolutely.
a Wolfe Society meeting. I think one of the great undiscussed and unstudied works of American dramatic theater is Welcome to Our City. It is an amazing play, start to finish. Thomas Wolfe, a lot of people don't know, began as a playwright. He wanted to write plays, but he wrote plays like he wrote novels. They were huge and had a lot of people in them. But Welcome to Our City, which I think he wrote in 20 or 21, before the crash. I mean, such a prescient, forward-looking play, involves these kinds of booster characters that are so blind to the reality.
Yeah.
Were you thinking about Welcome to Our City when you were writing this play?
Completely.
I mean, this novel's, forgive me.
No, yeah, I was. I was also thinking about later, fictional treatments of Wolfe coming back to Asheville and encountering this, just overwhelming boosterism that we're going to save ourselves by keeping the money moving.
Yeah.
That phrase.
And the uncle even says that.
Yeah.
You just got to run like water. You got to let it in your book. You got to let it keep moving.
Always end up with more.
Yeah.
You ever stop.
Like it's regenerating somehow.
Yeah. Money makes money.
Yeah.
No, I was absolutely thinking about Wolfe, and I was thinking about sort of the history of Asheville in the 20s. Because for those who are keeping score at home, the stock market crash, of course, happened in October of 29 when Look Homeward Angel was published, among other things. But, and the action in this book doesn't take place until a year later. Asheville didn't get the message.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it was clear, if you were paying attention, that the bottom was about to fall out. But Asheville was drunk on development, not unlike today.
Sure.
And it was drunk on the tourist dollar. And as long as we could keep people visiting here and coming back here, we'd be glad to take their money.
Yeah.
And we could live forever on that high.
We could live forever. That's what you should have called the book. We could
live forever.
Yeah.
Well, the epigraph for the book is Ralph Waldo Emerson. Sometimes money costs too much.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the idea that money is somehow a narcotic, and that our belief and our desire and our addiction feeds that and brings us to the brink. Well, not just to the brink of disaster. The original idea for the book was to write about that one day, November the 20th, 1930, when the banks failed.
Yeah.
A lot of writers will say I had that image in my mind. Well,
Sure.
the image I had was of somebody standing in the bank. The doors are locked. They'll never open again, looking out through the window at the people standing outside, pounding on the door.
Yeah.
So, this is our life. You can't take our life away. Well, the truth was they could, and
Yeah.
they did. Later, it became clear to me that it should probably be a woman,
Yeah.
for all kinds of reasons. But that idea that within 24 hours, life in Western North Carolina, as people had known it and as they had imagined it, ceased to exist.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Western North Carolina, to close us out here, we have the North Carolina lightning round. Well, I am going to ask you your 5, maybe not favorite, but 5 historic sites in Western North Carolina that you really appreciate.
Yeah. If we had a big red bus and we could go on a tour. A couple are in Asheville, several are in Madison County, because that's sort of my postage stamp of soil. And there's that energy back and forth between town and country. One, let's just start there. It's the Sky Club. I think for years there was this spirit of kind of I don't know what we would call it, outlaw,
Lawlessness.
lawlessness, right? That came to the Sky Club, and in fact, jazz. The more I read about the 20s and studied the 20s, it became obvious that jazz was frightening. Was this form? It was like what Elvis became later on. Don't look and don't listen, or you'll inevitably be corrupt. You'll dance, and if you dance, you'll drink, and if you drink, you'll smoke, and if you smoke, you'll take your clothes off. So there was that sense. So the Sky Club, certainly,
and it's a beautiful building.
It's a gorgeous building.
Yeah.
Lynn and I got to go there after the book was written, and because one of the condos was for sale, and we got to look out over you look out over Asheville, in a regal kind of sense. Another place in Asheville, I think, is Lexington Avenue. Again, people don't realize now it's the only street that I'm aware of in North Carolina, let's just say, that has 3 and maybe 3.5 novels set on it. Fred Chappell's The Gaudy Place, Ely's Last One Home, and Lying on the Hearth are both centrally located around Lexington. Scenes from the Sky Club are set on Lexington Avenue. It was the crossroads between country and city.
Sure, that's where the farmers market was.
That's where the farmers market was. It's you could buy anything there, legal or illegal. And
when I first moved to Asheville, you still could.
You still did. Now, as well. When I was at UNCA, don't go to Lexington.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless you want to get stabbed or catch a disease. And so Lexington, I think, has a long and storied history. It's been gentrified now, but in those days, in the good old days, it was where country came to town and town went down to visit with country.
Sure.
In Madison, which is in so many ways home, I think the Shelton Laurel, because of the massacre at Shelton Laurel, there have been so many writers. Charles Frazier, Ron Rash, many others who go back there in their imagination because of the Shelton Laurel massacres. Somehow that gets at, and this speaks to today, world in which we somehow have found ourselves hating each other and would do each other real harm. And so that's a place. Even though nobody today seems to know exactly where the massacre took place, the general area is important. Marshall, which is one of the primary settings for In the Fullness of Time, which is the last novel. Marshall is an astonishing place. It's important in terms of music. It's important in terms of storytelling. It's important in terms of literature. As people who live there said forever, it's a mile long, a block wide, and hell deep. Again, And then I say for the last, Hot Springs, and you and I talked a lot about this. To me, Hot Springs is an amazing little place because there's more history. It's like Troy. If you started digging in Hot Springs, you would find at least 7 layers of history going all the way back to the Warm Springs Hotel that Chuck Frazier writes about in 13 Moons, and that is a big part of my work in That Bright Land and other places, all the way up through the current day.
Sure.
And both Marshall and Hot Springs, of course, were devastated by Hurricane Helene. But that doesn't change their historical significance, and it doesn't change the fact that they're coming back.
Sure, absolutely. Well, Terry, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you for hosting us in your
Oh,
home,
yeah.
and I've enjoyed this so much.
Absolutely. Right back at you.
This episode of the Our State Book Club podcast is sponsored by Deerfield Episcopal Retirement Community in Asheville, North Carolina.
I'm proud to dedicate the 2026 season of the Our State Book Club podcast to D.G. Martin.
What might it be like underneath the sunrise in the state of flight? Coming back on me, it seems wonderful, the wandering mountain birds on a beach. Never moments ever wasted, turning away from your love. Honeybees, gardens of sweeter fruit, never tasted, no turning to other things. Will you be, will you see? Sweeter fruit, never tasted, don't turn your back on me. Mountains pushing into the sea, mountains into the sea.